Hello, this is September 21, 2022, and this is the Richard Munro Show. Today I read a wonderful piece by H.W. Brown's on Robert Burns. He's one of my favorite poets, and it's worth going over and having some comments. Burns was talking about death. Oh, death, the poor man's dearest friend, the kindest and the best. Welcome thee o'er my aged limbs, are laid at thee at rest. The great, the wealthy fear thy blow, from pomp and pleasure torn. But oh, blessed relief for those that weary laden mourn. When Robert Burns wrote these lines in 1784, they expressed wisdom that had been conventional for tens of thousands of years of human history. Life was fraught with care and suffering. Most people were hungry, sick, or wounded, or in danger of becoming hungry, sick, or wounded soon. Moments of happiness were rare and brief, and they were always clouded with the memory of suffering past and the prospect of suffering future. Death was not feared, but welcomed. It promised release from this mortal coil. One measure of human progress, and perhaps the most profound measure, is the change in attitudes towards death since Burns' time. Already in his day and in his poem, the rich feared death, for it would tear them from the earthly pleasures they had known. Their fear of death, or at least the wish to keep on living, has democratized the world as the world has grown richer. Mortality, traditionally seen as a blessing, is now treated as something for science and medicine and individuals to battle against. In the process, the afterlife has lost much of its purchase on the human imagination. Death was the moment when the scales of justice would be rebalanced. The poor, which is to say the great majority of humans, would move to a better life. The few rich would have their comeuppance. Very few of the rich might get into heaven, but it would be very few indeed. If Jesus was any authority, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God, he told his disciples. It's no accident that spread of wealth coincided with a decline in religion. Certainly there are other factors. Science provided explanations for events and phenomena previously ascribed to the gods. But at the emotional level, at which most people operate most of the time, the lessening of human misery made religion's role as gatekeeper to the afterlife less salient on a daily basis. Robert Burns was contemporaneous with Thomas Jefferson, yet Burns didn't buy into the Enlightenment optimism and allowed Jefferson to claim for humans a right to the pursuit of happiness. The Scottish poet looked backward to that long age when such a claim would have seemed ludicrous, while any American philosopher looked ahead to a time when happiness itself, not just its pursuit, became broadly held expectation. Keeping Burns in mind helps explain much about the past that is otherwise difficult for modern sensibility to understand. Pre-modern societies put up with all sorts of practices that are intolerable today. When the conditions of daily life made people long for death, how much worse could it be to be a slave than a miserable peasant? And if that slave died sooner than the peasant, all the better for the slave. When warfare typically included the slaughter of non-combatants, the lives lost wouldn't have been longer happy anyway. The oppression of women seemed such a big deal when so many were going to die in childbirth. Most people would prefer their own circumstances to those people living in olden times, if permitted the choice. Yet Burns was onto something that gave an edge to the ancients in one regard. We are just as certain to die as our distant forebears were. But where for most of us death is a source of trepidation, judging by the efforts we devote to delaying it, they eyed their end with equanimity, even gratitude. We should all be so mellow and so wise. I was surprised to see a piece on Robert Burns, who's one of my favorite poets. He also, as H.W. Brown's knows, a favorite poet of Abraham Lincoln. Some people, if they think of him at all, remember Burns as an author of romantic lyrical poems, which he was. But as Brands pointed out, Burns was much more. Burns was a great and original thinker who lived on the cusp of the modern age. He once took a trip on a steam-powered boat, but who lived with a close tie to the Iron Age of Scotland, which ended abruptly on April 16th, 1746, as Toynbee pointed out some years ago. The history of Scotland that Burns knew was a series of disasters and defeats, punctuated by some extraordinary victories. He was aware that some secured much less of the world's material goods and security, and others secured more, perhaps more than their respective merit deserved. Burns may not have known so-called white privilege, but he did know the privilege of rank. The rank is but the guinea stamp, the man's the gold for all that. Burns lived on the edge of poverty and saw sickness and early death all around him. Mary Morrison, the toast of the town, was known to be among the most beautiful women in Mochline from age 16 to 20. Yes, Streen went to the trembling string, the dance gaeth licked at haw. To thee my fancy took its wing, but I sat and neither heard nor saw. Oh, this was fair and that was braw, and yon the toast of all the tune. I sighed and said amang them all, Ye are na Mary Morrison. O Mary, canst thou wreck his peace, wha for thy sake would gladly die? Or canst thou break this heart, whose only fault is loving thee? If love for love thou wilt not gie, at least pity to me shown. A thocht ungentle can I be, the thocht of Mary Morrison. I've been to her grave in Mochline. It's a place of pilgrimage. Mrs. Abraham Lincoln went to it also. Mary Morrison died at age 20, so she had many gifts. She had the gift of beauty, but not of health or longevity. Burns was wise, but the power of his poetry is in its absolute truthfulness. Wordsworth recognized that Burns' leading characteristic was his utter sincerity and almost absolute truthfulness. Wordsworth acknowledged few masters, but of Burns he said, "Whose light I hailed when it first shone, and showed my youth how verse may build a princely throne on humble truth." Burns was a son of workers from the lower levels of society, and through education and talent made a name for himself. He commented on society, both high and low, on nature, homely or beautiful, with the clearest eye and the warmest Scottish heart. Burns touched myriad points, seeing the pretense of hollowness of men and women he met, and also the sterling core of their virtues. Yet once upon a time there was a lad born in Ayr, Robert Burns. To go to that rude cottage of Ayr, as I've been, the birthplace of Burns, so near the Brigadoon, is to experience a secular epiphany as to the essential equality of all humanity. It's to experience awe at the true mystery of talent and genius. It's an affirmation of what secret treasures can be found anywhere among any class, gender, or race. If individuals are given a proper upbringing and a decent education and a chance to develop, discover, and explore their God-given gifts. As Burns' father knew, it is hard to be poor. At the age of 19, Burns' father was a homeless, migrant farm laborer, but he was proud he could read, write, and cipher, and he always carried the old book with him. Agnes Broom, Mrs. Burns, and her husband kept their entire family of 7 under one roof and surrounded their children's lives with care and tender love. Both mother and father displayed a piety that was neither excessive nor harsh, unlike the extreme Calvinism that was the mode of the established clergy of the time. In Burns' house, physical labor was incessant. Food and fuel were scarce. But education and religion were not neglected. They were rather held by the Burns family as an essential, sacred duty. And Mrs. Burns sang so sweet that Rob often could not sleep as she crooned the old Scots sangs to him. Burns had no shame of his very humble origin. From scenes like these, old Scotia's grandeur springs, that makes her loved at home, revered abroad. Princes and lords are but the breath of kings, an honest man's the noblest work of God. As John Masefield has written, I've seen flowers in stony places, and kindness done by men with ugly faces, and the gold cup won by the worst horse at the races, so I trust too. Sir Walter Scott, who met Burns as a boy at Adam Ferguson's home in Edinburgh, said meeting Burns was like meeting Virgil in person. He described Burns as a man of dignified plainness and simplicity. His person was strong and robust. There was a strong expression of sense and shrewdness. His eye was large and of a dark cast, which glowed, I say, literally glowed, when he spoke with feeling or interest. I never saw another eye in a human head, though I have seen the most distinguished men of my time. Sir Walter Scott. Burns had no Gaelic, but he read Macpherson's translations and adaptations. In addition to writing his own lyrics, Burns was the preserver, without pay, of ancient airs and songs of Scotland. Burns heard Gaelic song in the Highlands, and no doubt at Ferguson's Edinburgh home. These ancient rhapsodies were interpreted for him, no doubt, and brought him into contact with centuries of verse praising the country, the mist-covered mountains, the flowers, the birds. Beneath the milk-white thorn that scents the evening gale. Flow gently, sweet Afan, among thy green braes. Flow gently, I'll sing thee a song in thy praise. But och, pleasures are like poppy spread. You seize the flower, its bloom is shed, or like the snowfall in the river, white, a moment, and then gone forever. In a sense, Burns is a Scottish Hemingway, literary but appealing to men. Unlike Hemingway, however, Burns is equally appealing to women, whom Burns did not recognize as inferior to men or merely sex objects, but something complementary. If not as physically strong, they were, if anything, worthier in some ways than men, and worthy of love, protection, and sacrifice. For ye say douche is near at this, you're noch but senses asses o. The wisest man the world e'er saw, he dearly loved the lasses o. All nature swear the lovely dears, her noblest works she classes o. Her printed hand she tried on man, and then she made the lasses o. Green grow the rashes o, green grow the rashes o, the sweetest hours I ever spent are spent among the lasses o. The regiment and male bonding were great. A family life led by a good woman was the center of all that was good in Cleague. To make a happy fireside climb to weans and wife, aye, that is the true pathos sublime of human life. Burns looks firmly towards the future and democracy, but he never forgot his own and his people's past. Had he lived, he might have emigrated to America, as did his direct descendants. Filmmakers Rick and Ken Burns are direct descendants of Robert Burns. Burns speaks to the world, if they would hear, about the true meaning of liberty and the nobility of man, and woman too, who dwell in every land and every walk of life. Burns suffered with the poor and the oppressed, be they colonials, black slaves from Senegal, Scots, Chinese or English or French, or American factory workers. Man's inhumanity to man, he wrote, makes countless thousands mourn. Wrote Burns, whatever mitigates the woes or increases the happiness of others, this is my criterion of goodness. And whatever injures society at large, or an individual in it, this is my measure of iniquity. Burns preaches not irreligion, but tolerance for skeptics as well as for all faiths and denominations. Burns sings not just of woman's beauty, but of her rights and of her mind and the equality of the tender soul created in the image of God. All that Scotland had done and suffered, the memory of her heroic but disastrous history, the heads bloody but unbowed, the strong, valiant manhood of her Highland men, the deep Sunsea lyric womanhood and pragmatism of her lassies, the memory of the Dwachers Adi, splendid ancient Gaelic heritage, the songs of the Hebrides, the beauty of Scotland's nature and scenery, of the highlands and lowlands and islands, may have vanished without a trace, without the unconquerable spirit of Robert Burns. And the British people and the people around the world would have been for the poor. Yes, all this could have been utterly destroyed by the mindless uniformity, the depressing deracination of the urban poor, manufactured ugliness of slum upon slum and numb proletarian anime, had Scotland been left without the Scottish and Celtic Renaissance led by Burns. Truly the pen and the heart and the lips are mightier than the sword. Neobli Scottis. Do not forget the poet. Do not forget Robert Burns. So it's a wonderful that I grew up loving poetry. And like my father, I've always loved poetry and song. Here's, I'll show you a picture. Here's a picture of an ancient papyrus of Callimachus, the great Greek poet of which only fragments remain. So like my father, I've always loved poetry and song. So do I have a favorite poem? What is it? Well, to choose a favorite poem, I'd have to discuss my favorite poets and poems I've returned to again and again. According to Oxford, poetry is, quote, literary work in which special intensity is given to the expression of feelings and ideas by the use of distinctive style and rhythm, poems collectively or as a genre of literature. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, poetry is, quote, literature that evokes a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience or of a specific emotional response through language chosen and arranged for its meaning, sound, and rhythm. I think it almost goes without saying that great poetry is beautiful, memorable, and emotionally powerful. So one can appreciate many authors and poems, but a favorite poem must be, number one, memorable. You remember all of it or important parts. Have literary beauty. And number three, touch the heart. Gilbert Hyatt taught me this one, which my father certainly knew in the original French. For art alone is great, the bust survives the state, the crown the potentate, and the forgotten seal turned by the plowman's steel, an emperor may reveal. Things perish, gods have passed, but songs sublimely cast shall citadels outlast. That's Théophile Gautier, Les Arts, 1852. This is a great piece of poetry. But lover poetry will see allusions and echoes of former poets, Callimachus, Horace, Shakespeare. Hyde even wrote some poetry. He was a master translator of Latin, Greek, German. I like his post-obit that was discovered recently among his papers. He was married for many years to the love of his life, fellow Scot and fellow American by choice, Helen McGuinness. What will you think of me when I die, Helen? There won't be an official life, a paragraph at most. But you alone could write a volume. Most is secret, and that you will now write. The rest is public, covering 50 harsh, laborious years and unimportant. But remember me as we live secretly and happily. He was a merry man, God rest his soul. He was a merry man and loved you well. Wonderful little poem by Gilbert Hyatt. W.H. Auden, another favorite poet, said, quote, a poet is, before anything else, a person who is passionately in love with language. Voice of language and languages, and the musicality of languages. What is older? I ask my students many times. The alphabet or literature? It's a trick question, but perhaps an important one. The oldest literature is oral and spoken. Poetry, song, oratory, the legend and epic poetry like Homer. Auden wrote a simple but beautiful elegy for JFK. A nation mourned on November 22nd, 1963. It is said out of great mourning comes great art. W.H. Auden's elegy for JFK is a testament to that. Elegy for JFK by W.H. Auden. When a just man dies, lamentation and praise, sorrow and joy are one. Why then? Why there? Why thus, we cry, did he die? The heavens are silent. What he was, he was. What he is fated to become depends on us. Remembering his death, how we choose to live will decide its meaning. When a just man dies, lamentation and praise, sorrow and joy are one. According to Robert Kennedy's biographers, after the murder of his brother, Jackie Kennedy gave Robert a copy of Hamilton's The Greek Way while they were in Antigua for an Easter holiday weekend. Robert, transfixed by the book, barely left his room after that. He was fascinated by Greek poetry and translation, especially Aeschylus. When Martin Luther King, RFK, spoke to a crowd in Indianapolis to announce the news, he quoted or paraphrased his favorite poet, Aeschylus. In our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. Hamilton had actually written, drop, drop in our sleep upon the heart, sorrow falls, memories pain, and to us through against our own will, even against our own, despite comes wisdom by the awful grace of God. Robert Kennedy's versions are misremembered or adapted. It's a fine quotation in itself. And I would say that people who are poetically attuned will quote and paraphrase poetry all the time. And we certainly did when we learn songs, we would adapt them for ourselves. That's Edith Hamilton, The Greek Way. I have 3 copies of the book, by the way. I have my father's paperback copy from the 1950s, a copy my son gave me that was in the Brophy Library, and an Audible recorded book. It's a classic, so I've read it, listened to it many times. I think I've read it at least 6 times. Hamilton, along with Will Durant and Gilbert Hyatt, is a wonderful guide to the classics. She wrote her book after a lifetime of teaching and travel to Greece. She wrote not for fame or money, but merely out of love, and it shows. Elegies are poems of lamentation. The word elegy comes from the Greek word elegia, which means to lament, and this is a powerful lament. There's grief in an elegy and pain and praise, but also consolation. We will all suffer personal losses in this life. My daughter's classmate from high school, one of her best friends, we just cut her obituary out of the newspaper this morning. She died last week, just 30 years old. Beautiful, wonderful, sweet girl. One of the nicest people I know. Very sad. So we will all suffer personal losses in this life because no man and no woman is master of the line of his or her life. We are all mortal. The Bible reminds man constantly of his mortality. Of course, Genesis 3:19. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread till you return to the ground, because it is from here you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And Psalm 103. As for man, his days are like grass. As a flower in the field, so he flourishes. When the wind has passed over it, it is no more, and its place acknowledges it no longer. Psalm 39. Lord, make me to know my end and what extent of my days. Let me know how transient I am. Behold, you have made my days as handbreadths, and my lifetime are nothing in your sight. Surely every man at his best is a mere breath. Selah. Surely every man walks about as a phantom. Surely they make an uproar for nothing. He amasses riches and does not know who will gather them. The Stoics had the insight that our mortality and the prospect of death can actually make our lives much happier than they would be otherwise, because one develops a deep gratitude for our precious days and our precious relationships. Every day of health and love is a gift. And as my mother used to say, life and love are just brief moments in time, so we should express our love daily and often. True. Great poems recall powerful feelings and memories, preserved as in amber for all time. Robert Graves, another favorite author and poet, wrote wisely, I believe every English poet should read the English classics, master the rules of grammar before attempts to break or bend them, travel abroad, experience the horrors of sordid passion, and if he's lucky enough, know the love of an honest woman. I guess as a soldier and a traveler, he knew a lot of sordid women too. I have read Milton, Shakespeare, Tennyson, Burns, Auden, Blake. I can't say I've read all of Shakespeare or all of Burns. I've read most of the best of the authors of the Greek tradition, the Roman tradition, the Spanish tradition, the French tradition, the British tradition, the American tradition, and some of the best of German and Russian literature, about which I know less but hope to know more. In another place, I'll write about the books I loved and were influential. John F. Kennedy loved literature, music, and poetry. He studied the great authors, and he read Churchill deeply. This intellectual background we see in his speeches and in his live press conferences. One of his favorite poems was Alan Seeger's I Have a Rendezvous with Death. Statue of Anthony Seeger is on the monument in the Place États-Unis in Paris. I've seen it. It honors fallen Americans who volunteered for France during the Great War. I have a special feeling for the fallen Americans of World War I, the doughboys, because if they had not come to help the Allies, it's very likely old Pop, my Scottish grandfather, would have not survived the wars. He survived second heaps, but he would not have survived fourth or fifth or sixth heaps. Returning to JFK, it is ironic, perhaps, because we know he did, in fact, like Lincoln, have a rendezvous with death. But we have to remember his brother Joe Kennedy Jr. was killed in action trying to stop V-2 rocket attacks on England. JFK himself was listed as missing in action and presumed killed in 1943. He was injured in his back he was in pain for the rest of his life. In fact, his steel brakes made his body more rigid and more vulnerable to assassination, giving the killer 7 seconds he needed to make 3 shots. Only the last was fatal. Seeger's poem has wonderful imagery. Remember, he has served his time by this time since 1914. He knew trench warfare was a grim business and almost unbelievable casualty rates and weeks and months of continuous combat. He must have felt, as JFK felt, that he was on borrowed time. It has to be one of the most poignant war poems ever written. I have a rendezvous with death. Alan Seeger, 1917. I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade. When spring comes back with rustling shade and apple blossoms fill the air, I have a rendezvous with death. When spring brings back blue days and fair, and maybe he shall take my hand and lead me to his dark land, and close my eyes and quench my breath, and maybe I shall pass him still. I have a rendezvous with death on some scarred slope of battered hill. When spring comes around this year and the first meadow flowers appear, God knows 'twere better to be deep pillowed in silk and scented down, where love throbs out in blissful sleep, pulse nigh to pulse, breath to breath, where hushed awakenings are dear, but I have a rendezvous with death. At midnight, in some flaming town, when spring trips north again this year, and I, my pledge word and true, I shall not fail in that rendezvous. And wonderful, beautiful imagery of the joy of life and, of course, the horrors of war, and he had his duty to do. About a month before John F. Kennedy was killed, he thoughtfully said this about Robert Frost and poetry. Listen to the recording sometime. It's a great speech. When power leads man towards ignorance, when power leads man towards arrogance, poetry reminds him of his limitations. When power narrows the area of man's concern, poetry reminds him of the richness and diversity of his existence. When power corrupts, poetry cleanses. For art establishes the basic human truths which must serve as the touchstones of our judgment. The artist, however faithful to his personal vision of reality, becomes the last champion of the individual mind and sensibility against an intrusive society and officious state. The great artist is thus a solitary figure. He has, as Frost said, a lover's quarrel with the world. In pursuing his perception of reality, he must often sail against the currents of his time. Wonderful discussion on the great value of poetry. Poetry must serve as a touchstone of our values about love, family life, faith, and death. One of my favorite Spanish poems is A las Ruinas de Italica by Rodrigo Caro. And I won't read the whole thing in Spanish, but the basic of the poem is about Italica was a marvelous imperial city, the birthplace of Trajan and Hadrian, had beautiful gardens and baths and beautiful homes, and he said, emulation yesterday of the ages, today ashes, vast solitudes. Fate did not respect you, nor death, nor for your wisdom, nor for your strength. And Italica fell, sadly. And now the name is just like a groan in the wind. And it had turned out basically how it was so beautiful in the garden and then became sort of a rustic haunt of lizards and just a desert. I have many favorite authors and poems, many Irish and many Scottish, many English, many Spanish. I've translated poetry for myself from Gaelic, Spanish, and Latin. I love Horace and Virgil. I love Garcia Lorca, Antonio Machado, Calderón de la Barca, the poem of the Cid, the Juglar de Soria, Rodrigo Caro, of course, Walter Scott, Byron, Whitman, Kipling. Tommy is one that I know. And of course, when they talk about the Thin Red Line, it's an allusion to the brave stand of the 83rd Highlanders, Balaclava. We went into a public house to get a pint of beer. Publican says, we serve no redcoats here. The girls behind the bar, they giggled and laughed and fit to die. I outs to the street again, and myself, I says, And it's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy go away. But thank you, Mr. Atkins, when the band begins to play. The band begins to play, my boys, the band begins to play. But thank you, Mr. Atkins, when the band begins to play. I went to a theater as sober as I could be. They gave a drunk civilian room, but there ain't none for me. Then they sent me to the gallery around the music halls. Where comes the fighting, Lord, they shove me in the stalls. For it's Tommy this and Tommy that, and Tommy walk outside. But special train for Atkins, troopers on the tide. When the troop ship's on the tide, the troop ship's on the tide. Special train for Atkins when the troop ship's on the tide. Ah, yes, making mock of uniforms that guard you while you sleep is cheaper than them uniforms, and they're starvation cheap. And hustling drunken soldiers when they're going a large to bit is 5 times better business than parading in full kit. But it's Tommy this and ouch, your soul. But it's thin red line of heroes when the drums begin to roll. The drums begin to roll, my boys, the drums begin to roll. Ah, it's a thin red line of heroes when the drums begin to roll. We ain't no thin red heroes, but no, we ain't no blackguards too, but single men in barracks most remarkable like you. And if our conduct isn't all your fancy pants, single men in barracks don't grow into pastor saints. But it's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy fall behind. But it's please walk in front, sir, when there's trouble in the wind. There's trouble in the wind, there's trouble in the wind. It's please walk in front, sir, when there's trouble in the wind. You better talk a better food for us in schools and fires and all. We wait for extra rations if you treat us rational. Don't mess with the cookroom slops, but prove it to our face. The widow's uniform is not the soldier man's disgrace. But it's Tommy this and Tommy that shook out the brute. Savior of his country when the guns begin to shoot. And it's Tommy this and Tommy that and anything you please. Tommy ain't a blooming fool. You bet the Tommy sees. As I mentioned before, I love the songs and poems of Robert Burns. He has to be one of my favorite poets. His letters and poems have a tremendous variety. Burns loved the lassies and wrote some of the most tender love songs ever written. Fair is the morn and flowery May, and sweet is night in autumn mild, when roving through the garden gay, or wandering in the lonely wild. But woman, nature's darling child, that all her charms she does compile, for there the works are foiled by the bonny lass of Ballochmyle. Or had she been a country swain, and I a happy country swain, though sheltered in the lowest shed that ever rose on Scotland's plain, though weary winter's wind and rain, with joy with rapture I would toil, and nightly to my bosom strain the bonny lass of Ballochmyle. Of course, I fond kiss. Had we never loved so blindly, had we never loved so kindly, never met or never parted, had we never been broken-hearted. Tam O'Shanter Burns wrote movingly, but pleasures are like poppy spread. You seize the flowers, bloom its shed, or like the snow flown in the river, a moment white, then melts forever. Burns' song Farewell to the Highlands has to be one of my great favorites. When we went to the Old Kirk in Burns country, I surprised many by reciting and singing the song by heart. I've known it since I was a small boy. The tune is Felchini Musk, Song of the Musket, a Highland hunting song. Farewell to the Highlands, farewell to the North, the birthplace of valour, the country of worth. Wherever I wander, wherever I rove, the hills of the Highlands forever I love. My heart's in the Highlands, my heart is not here. My heart's in the Highlands, a chasing the deer. A chasing the wild deer and following the roe. My heart's in the Highlands, wherever I go. Farewell to the mountains, high covered with snow. Farewell to the straths and green valleys below. Farewell to the forests and wild-hanging woods. Farewell to the torrents and loud-pouring floods. My heart's in the Highlands, wherever I go. Burns courageously spoke out for justice, for mercy, for humanity, for memory, for respect. He elevated the views of the common man. What though on hamely fare we dine, with hodden grey and all that? He fools their silks and knaves their wine. A man's a man, for all that. Burns spoke for Scotland's law and about days of infamy. The lovely lass of Inverness, they joy no pleasure can she see. For e'en to morn she cries alas, and aye the salt tear blends her ee. Dromossy moor, dromossy day, a waeful day it was for me. For then I lost my father dear and brethren three. Their winding sheet the bloody clay, their graves are growing green to see, and by them lies the dearest lad that ever blessed a woman's ee. Away to thee, thou cruel lord, a bloody man I trow thou be, for many a heart that has made sair, that ne'er did rang to thine or thee. And of course, the cruel lord was the German Duke of Cumberland. And when Andrew Roberts was writing his book on George III, I helped him with some research and editing and so on. We exchanged a correspondence about the Duke of Cumberland. I mentioned that Wolfe was a captain at Culloden, Dromossy Moor's Culloden, and Wolfe was ordered by Cumberland to execute all the Jacobite prisoners. And Wolfe said, no, these men are prisoners of war. He refused to execute them. But Cumberland had a very heavy hand. And one of the reasons why he is so hated in Scotland, he's called the Butcher, is because once he loosened his dogs of war on the Highlands, he killed indiscriminately and even killed Hanoverian Highlanders who were allied to the king, people who are on his side and their families. They were caught up in the violence. They're just indiscriminate violence. And that's one of the reasons he was so hated. Not merely was he cruel, but he's indiscriminately cruel, killing some of his own friends and allies. And for that reason, he will always be remembered with infamy. There's a statue to him, I think, in London, but I don't think there ever will be in Scotland. Perhaps you remember the poem To a Mouse, which seems at first a simple poem about nature. With Burns' eyes as the lord of the farm, he realizes that the mouse is like the lowest born jote flitter. A jote flitter is a migrant worker. The picture is winter and it is very cold. It's remarkable that the poet of that brutal and often barbaric time is showing a kind heart to a small wild animal of nature, as if nature herself were sacred. He parallels our world and the world of the lowly mouse. You might recall he said, the best laid plans, best laid schemes of mice and men gang after gley, oft go awry. The Gaels of old were of the opinion that the work of poets were important to the health of people's minds. I believe J.S. Blackie, a well-known classical and Gaelic scholar, said that the function of a poet was to call us back to nature and truth, the spoiled children of convention and affection. Of course, convention in Gaelic, Fonkeltas, means fashionable or vain imitation. Burns had that genius to wake us up to reality and away from our self-indulgent complaining about petty things. Perhaps you remember the poem about the small little beast. We get current in beastie. What panic is in thy breastie? Still thou blessed compared with me. The present only touches thee, but och, I cast backward my ee, on prospects drear, and forward I cannot see, but I guess and fear. Certainly one of my favorite poems. I've translated it to Spanish. Ratoncillo, estás dichoso bien haber comparado a mí. El presente solo te toca, pero ay, echo un vistazo atrás, a panoramas deprimientes. Y hacia adelante, aunque no puedo ver nada, con nada calculo y me temo lo peor. I fear the worst. Not as good as Burns, but pretty close. Heraclitus, though, has to be one of my favorite poems. It was a beloved poem of my late father, Thomas Munro, Jr. I read it at his funeral in 2004. He died September 27th, 2003. I think because we have with it concurrence of Greek poetry and English poetry, my father loved it so well. He loved the Greek poets and playwrights. He loved Shakespeare. William Corey, 1823-1892, made this incomparable translation of the African Callimachus of Cyrene, 3rd century. And I've said, this is probably my favorite poem. It was my father's favorite poem. We often discussed favorite poems, and he always came back to this. They told me, Heraclitus, they told me you were dead. They brought me bitter news to hear and bitter tears to shed. I wept as I remembered how often you and I had tired the sun with talking and sent him down the sky. And now thou art lying, my dear old carrion guest, a handful of grey ashes long, long ago at rest. Still are thy pleasant voices, thy nightingales awake. For death, he taketh all away, but them he cannot take. The nightingales mean delightful poems and songs. Writing is magical because it can connect two minds over miles and over the centuries. As Horace said, Ode 3:30, non omnis moriar, I shall not wholly die. Yes, my father is gone, and one day I'll be gone, but the songs and poems will live on. One of my mother's favorite songs was The Rowan Tree. It's one of the very last Scottish songs we sang together, including Auld Lang Syne, in December 2000. O Rowan Tree, oh there arose my father's prayer in holy evening's calm. How sweet was then my mother's voice in the martyr's psalm. Now all are gane will meet no mair, now all are gone will meet no more. Aneath the rowan tree, a hallow thoch surround thee twine, a hame of infancy. The rowan tree, in Scandinavia, rowans growing out of some inaccessible cliff in a rock or crevice is thought to have powerful magic. So trees are known as the flying rowan. They're also the prescribed wood in which runes were inscribed for divination. Rowan berries are edible to humans, but they're sour but rich in vitamin C and can be used to make a tart jam. In the old days, in the highlands of Scandinavia, they made rowan jam with venison. This was very nutritious. Wordsworth wrote, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion, recalled in tranquility. For those who have a harder time expressing themselves, reading poetry and reciting poetry, remembering poetry, can have a similar positive effect as writing it. Reading poetry can illuminate and help alleviate, if not cure, losses. Sing more, sing lang of the sangs, for ilka yen can tell, of joys or sorrows in the past, where memory loves to dwell. Remember not the silence, but the music. Remember not the tears, but the laughter. I'm going to close and have a little, see a picture. You can see when I was a younger man with my mother and father at our old family home. And lots of wonderful memories. And hopefully we can do more in the future.